Hello, my darlings. Madam Raven here with a unique H.P. Lovecraft story. It's entitled The Mystery of the Graveyard, or A Dead Man's Revenge, and it is a detective story. Chapter 1. The Burns Tomb. It was noon in the little village of Mainville, and a sorrowful group of people were standing around the Burns tomb. Joseph Burns was dead. When dying, he had given the following strange orders. Before you put my body in the tomb, drop this ball onto the floor at the spot marked A. Then he handed a small golden ball to the rector. The people greatly regretted his death. After the funeral services were finished, Mr. Dobson, the rector, said, "My friends, I will now gratify the last wishes of the deceased." So saying, he descended into the tomb to lay the ball on the spot marked A. Soon a funeral party began to be impatient, and after a time Mr. Charles Green, the lawyer, descended to make a search. He soon came up with a frightened face and said, "Mr. Dobson is not there." Chapter 2. The Mysterious Mr. Bell. It was 13:10 o'clock in the afternoon when the doorbell of the Dobson mansion rang loudly, and the servant, on going to the door, found an elderly man with black hair and side whiskers. He asked to see Miss Dobson. Upon arriving in her presence, he said, "Miss Dobson, I know where your father is, and for 10,000 pounds I will restore him. My name is Mr. Bell." "Mr. Bell," said Miss Dobson, "will you excuse me from the room for a moment?" "Certainly," replied Mr. Bell. In a short time she returned and said, "Mr. Bell, I understand you. You have abducted my father and hold him for a ransom." Chapter 3. At the police station. It was 3:20 o'clock in the afternoon when the telephone bell at the North End police station rang furiously, and Mr. Gibson, the telephone man, inquired what was the matter. "I've found out about Father's disappearance," a woman's voice said. "I'm Miss Dobson, and Father has been abducted. Send King John." King John was a famous Western detective. Just then a man rushed in and shouted, "Oh, terrors! Come to the graveyard!" Chapter 4. The West Window. Now let us return to Dobson Manor. Mr. Bell was rather taken aback by Miss Dobson's plain speaking, but when he recovered his speech, he said, "Don't put it quite so plain, Miss Dobson, for He was interrupted by the entrance of King John, who, with a brace of revolvers in his hand, barred all egress by the door. But quicker than thought, Bell sprang to a west window and jumped. Chapter 5. The Secret of the Grave. Now let us return to the station house. After the exited visitor had calmed down somewhat, he could tell his story straighter. He had seen 3 men in the graveyard shouting, "Bell! Bell, where are you, old man?" and acting very suspiciously. He then followed them and entered the Burns tomb, and when he followed them there, they touched a spring at a point marked A, and then disappeared. "I wish King John were here," said Gibson. "What's your name?" "John Spratt," replied the visitor. Chapter 6. The Chase for Bell. Now let us return to the Dobson mansion again. King John was utterly confounded at the sudden movement of Bell, but when he recovered from his surprise, his first thought was of chase. Accordingly, he started in pursuit of the abductor. He tracked him down to the RR station and found to his dismay that he had taken a train for Kent, a large city towards the south, and between which and Mainville there existed no telegraph or telephone. The train had just started. Chapter 7. The Black Hackman. The Kent train started at 10:35, and about 10:36, an exited dusty and tired man rushed into the Mainville hack office and said to a black hackman who was standing by the door, "If you can take me to Kent in 15 minutes, I will give you $1. "I don't see how I'm to get there," said the black man. "I haven't got a decent pair of horses, and I have $2, shouted the traveler. "All right," said the hackman. Chapter 8. Bell's Surprise. It was at 11 o'clock at Kent. All of the stores were closed but one, a dingy, dirty little shop down at the West End. It lay between Kent Harbor and the Kent and Mainville Railroad. In the front room, a shabbily dressed person of doubtful age was conversing with a middle-aged woman with gray hair. "I have agreed to do the job, Lindy," he said. "Bell will arrive at 11:30, and the carriage is ready to take him down to the wharf where a ship for Africa sails tonight." "But if King John were to come?" inquired Lindy. "Then we'd get nabbed and Bell would be hung," replied the man. Then a rapt sound at the door. "Are you Bell?" inquired Lindy. "Yes," was the response. "And I caught the 10:35, and King John got left, so we are all right." At 11:40, the party reached the landing and saw a ship looming up in the darkness. The Khedive of Africa was painted on the hull, and just as they were to step on board, a man stepped forward in the darkness and said, "John Bell, I arrest you in the Queen's name." It was King John. Chapter 9. The Trial. The day of the trial had arrived, and a crowd of people had gathered around the little grove, which served as a courthouse in summer, to hear the trial of John Bell on the charge of kidnapping. "Mr. Bell," said the judge, "what is the secret of the Burns tomb?" "I will tell you this much," said Bell. "If you go into the tomb and touch a certain spot marked A, you will find out." "Now where is Mr. Dobson?" queried the judge. "Here," said a voice behind them, and the figure of Mr. Dobson himself loomed up in the doorway. "How did you get here?" was the chorus. "'Tis a long story," said Dobson. Chapter 10. Dobson's Story. "When I went down into the tomb," said Dobson, "everything was darkness. I could see nothing, but finally I discerned the letter A printed on white on the onyx floor. I dropped the ball on the letter, and immediately a trapdoor opened and a man sprang up. It was this man here," he said, pointing to Bell, who stood trembling at the prisoner's dock. "And he pulled me down into a brilliantly lighted and palatial apartment, where I have lived until today. One day a young man rushed in and exclaimed, 'The secret is revealed!' and was gone. He did not see me. Once Bell left his key behind, and I took the impression in wax. The next day was spent in filing keys to fit the lock. The next day my key fitted, and the next, which is today, I escaped." Chapter 11. The Mystery Unveiled. "Why did the late J. Burns ask you to put the ball there at A?" inquired the judge. "To get me into trouble," replied Dobson. "He and Francis Burns, his brother, have plotted against me for years, and I knew not in which way they would harm me. "Seize Francis Burns!" yelled the judge. Chapter 12. Conclusion. Francis Burns and John Bell were sent to prison for life. Mr. Dobson was cordially welcomed by his daughter, who, by the way, had become Mrs. King John. Lindy and her accomplice was sent to Newgate for 30 days as aiders and abettors of a criminal escape. The end. Price, 25 cents. So quoth this raven. Well, my darlings, that was a very un-Lovecraftian Lovecraft story. Quite humorous. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and we'll look for my bell. If it's not there, follow me on Twitter, where it will tell you when I release stories, usually Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturday mornings. Farewell, my darlings.